Hello, everyone. Sorry I could not be there with you today, but I appreciate the opportunity to share this video with you in case anyone was interested in the talk and is hoping to sort of hear what I was going to say and then maybe connect further. So hopefully my email address is available to you. It'll be at the end of this video as well. So my talk for today is social media algorithms and social distrust. There we are. And it's worth noting that the ideas for this talk are adapted from a paper that I co-wrote with former colleagues Carolyn McLeod and Emily Stahaki at Western University. And my sort of aim here, and in some work I'm starting to develop, is to take the concepts and ideas that we sort of start to develop in this paper and really further expand upon them and also sort of apply them to the evolving social media landscape to see what these concepts that we've sort of articulated here can help us really see about algorithms functionality on social media. So the paper is open access. If anybody has a difficult time finding it and wants a copy, please, I'm happy to send you a PDF. Okay, so I wanted to start with a quote to sort of situate the talk from Astra Taylor in her excellent book, The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. And in that book, Taylor says the web reflects real-world inequities as often as it ameliorates them. And I want to zero in on that point, that the web reflects these inequities that we see in our sort of offline social worlds. And many of you probably recall that sort of with the advent of and sort of wide availability of the internet, a lot of people had this sort of very optimistic picture of what the internet would do, right? It's going to be this great democratizer, this great equalizer. And I think a lot of people have and perhaps still do feel that way about social media, right? Social media offers this space in which everybody presumably can participate on equal footing. Everybody has a voice, but we know that that's not in fact what happens, right? Think about the way social media amplifies certain voices, maybe silences, if you will, some other voices, and certainly constructs what voices we have exposure to in important ways. And that's what I really want to zero in on here. So the aim of the talk is to show how algorithms on social media worsen the problem of epistemic injustice and related problems of stereotyping and social distrust. So the plan is to first say what I mean by algorithms on social media, just some sort of stage setting. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to explain these concepts that my colleagues and I have termed algorithmic sorting and algorithmic targeting. In the third section, I'm going to connect these to a philosophical concept known as epistemic injustice and show how those processes worsen the problem of epistemic injustice. And lastly, I'm going to sort of make a theoretical point that as we continue to focus on problems of algorithmic injustice and algorithmic oppression, we need to also be paying attention to the sort of subtle, perhaps often invisible ways that algorithms are shaping our interpersonal and social lives, both on and offline. So to get started, I'm going to offer a few preliminaries on AI and algorithms on social media, presumably given sort of who's here. I take it everybody has enough of an interest in this stuff that we're all relatively familiar with what AI and algorithms are. Just briefly, Nick Polson and James Scott in their book AIQ explain that, you know, for many people, the term AI seems like this like science fiction fantasy, but of course, AI is something we all regularly interact with, and perhaps increasingly so. And they explain that when we think of AI, we should simply think of a sort of set of step-by-step instructions that a computer or system follows in order to perform some task. And they have this quote where they say, on its own, an algorithm is no smarter than a power drill. It just does one thing very well, like sorting a list of numbers or searching the web for pictures of cute animals, right? So on its own, it's sort of a tool. And then these simple tools get strung together to complete increasingly complicated tasks. And so the resulting chains of simple algorithms that get strung together to create these increasingly complex illusions of intelligent behavior are what we think of as AI. And they note that almost every AI system follows this sort of same template, this pipeline of algorithms. And what this pipeline does, as we all know, and this is relevant to thinking about what occurs on social media, is the pipeline takes in a bunch of data from a particular domain, performs a chain of calculations oriented toward a particular outcome, and outputs some prediction or decision or information arranged in some particular way. So a working definition borrowed here from Mark Hochulberg in this text, AI Ethics, is that AI is intelligence displayed or simulated by code or machines. So I want to focus here on AI thought of in this way on social media. So my claim is that algorithms on social media shape our informational, and I'll add social, channels and networks in important ways. And probably we're all familiar with many of the ways in which algorithms influence our informational networks, right? So this might be by mediating what appears in our search engines, as Sophia Nobles and others have pointed out, by determining what news sources are or are not presented to us, by structuring what does or does not appear on our social media feeds and in what order. And the extent of this influence is often invisible to us, many of us or all of us, and to varying degrees, despite it, of course, being sort of central to how the platforms operate. And this is because most users sort of passively accept the influence of algorithms. Like at this point, many people know that social media makes use of algorithms in particular ways, but we generally assume they're sort of net neutral, right? They're just the product of objective mathematical patterns. There's no sort of influence of background social junk influencing us here. And many people sort of take that for granted. But this assumed neutrality is, of course, a myth. In reality, what these algorithms on social media are doing is learning about individual users and therefore generating not neutral, but rather hyper-specific output tailored specifically to those users, right? Based on likes and shares and time spent engaging on particular pages or with particular users. As one programmer has noted, the power of the like button on Facebook to target advertisements is scary. Your liking gives a lot of insight into you as a person, and we can extend beyond sort of liking to, again, other behaviors such as sharing, viewing, and so on. And the end goal of the algorithm's ability to generate this sort of hyper-specific picture of individual users is, of course, explained by the business model of these platforms, right? The goal is keep users engaged and online to ultimately increase their exposure to ads, thereby generating ad revenue and so on, right? The short version, to drive profit. It's also worth noting here that there's something interesting about the disconnect between the apparent or sort of stated function of social media, which is to fill a social purpose, right? They're social networks after all. We all think we're on them for various social purposes. But what's supposed to be this social sort of activity or social network also ends up serving other purposes, right? For the platforms, it serves the purpose of generating a profit. So it's like a profit generated under the guise of like helping people connect with one another. But for users, it's also filling other purposes, right? And there are many purposes. It might be organizing in a political sense. It might be to sell one's products, right? Or to advertise one's creative productions. It could be all sorts of things. But it's worth noting that one of these sorts of functions that social media ends up filling is that it becomes an epistemic resource. Social media becomes a source of knowledge, a place in which people receive information or knowledge, for better or worse. So what we end up with is this complex interplay between the social and epistemic functions of social media that are mediated by these background sort of algorithmic processes, again, which are mostly invisible to users and that they sort of aren't in a position to fully understand, and therefore perhaps aren't sufficiently aware of or critical of. So I want to get us to think a little bit more about what these algorithms are really doing, right? And how they're shaping our epistemic and social worlds in important ways. So again, my colleagues and I have named two algorithmic processes, algorithmic sorting and algorithmic targeting, that we think contribute to the tailoring of content to specific users. And I'll further argue in a bit that both of these processes also contribute to conditions that likely worsen the moral, social, and epistemic problem of epistemic injustice and related problems of social distrust. So the process we've called algorithmic sorting involves the increasing separation of people on social media into different and increasingly disparate epistemic worlds, which come to have little overlap in informational content. And the result is that people come to know, or perhaps think they know, different, quote, facts, and may even come to rely on different standards of evidence or senses of who are relevant or credible experts on a particular topic. And consequently, the worldviews of others become increasingly distant, unfamiliar, or unrecognizable. So this is the algorithmic sorting effect, sorting people into different epistemic worlds. Algorithmic targeting occurs when informational content is placed directly in front of specific users based on the algorithm's prediction about their likelihood to view or engage with it. So the algorithms here direct users' attentions to particular things, based again on those inputs like patterns or time spent engaging particular pages. And it's like algorithmic sorting in that algorithmic targeting is also shaping our epistemic worlds, right? It's putting particular bits of informational content in front of particular users. It's worth noting that algorithmic targeting is unique and perhaps uniquely pernicious because it involves presenting specific content to users based on their susceptibility to accepting or believing or liking or approving of it, again, as determined by the algorithm. So in this way, targeting plays a special sort of role in epistemic world-making because it amounts to belief reinforcement, right? It's giving people content that they're already determined to be sympathetic or susceptible to, right? So it's giving people content that's going to appear normal in the epistemic worlds into which they've been sorted. This can lead to an overly and unduly inflated epistemic self-confidence. It's worth noting that this kind of thing happens all the time on social media. At times, it can be relatively benign from a sort of social sense, right? So taking myself, if I open my Facebook page, I might get lots of things sort of targeted to me. For example, right, advertisements for new camping equipment, or maybe advertisements for a band that I like coming through town, or maybe recommendations for vegan cooking or something like that. And these bits of content are placed in front of me precisely because the algorithm has determined some facts about my interest, right? In camping, in music, in plant-based cuisine, whatever it is. And what this targeting does is attempts to get me to act on my preferences, right? To buy something or to spend time engaging with something. But the epistemic effect beyond that is that it can also reinforce my own beliefs, my own biases toward the popularity of the things I prefer. It reinforces that there's something valuable about the things that I already enjoy or value, right? The message I receive, even if subconsciously, is that these things must be important or good or worth pursuing. Why else would they be all over my feed? So in this way, the targeting of particular content in front of users plays on our cognitive biases in interesting and perhaps at times worrisome ways. There's a sort of confirmation bias effect, right? Because not all cases are like camping or vegan cooking, right? There are more socially pernicious examples of this, right? It's well documented that social media platforms, in the interest of increasing engagement and therefore profit, target dangerous things, dangerous conspiracy theories, often socially laden conspiracy theories. And there's tons of examples of this that I'm sure we're familiar with. So taken together, those two processes, algorithmic targeting and sorting, have a significant impact on the epistemic landscape online. I want to quickly note that what I'm describing might sound like other familiar concepts, namely echo chambers and filter bubbles, and you might say, why, bring new terms into the debate? Why not use these terms? There are a number of reasons for this. One, these terms are not sort of consistently and reliably used in the literature. TNUN has used these terms in ways that I find particularly helpful, but they're not necessarily the ways that you always see these terms used in the literature. Moreover, these terms are not describing the processes. They're rather describing something like an end state, right? The result of some processes would be that people end up perhaps in something like an echo chamber, or perhaps something like an epistemic bubble, as TNUN uses the term. So these are terms that are describing sort of end situations. Whether or not people end up in sort of perfectly closed echo chambers or something like that is sort of beyond the space of what I want to talk about here. Rather, I want to think about algorithmic sorting and targeting as processes, right? Processes that lead us into increasingly separate and polarized social and epistemic worlds, even if we don't end up in something perfectly filtered or sort of perfectly closed off or something like that. So I'm not describing here an end state, and I'm not making any claims about the sort of end state. I'm describing processes that, to varying extents, based on facts about our own social media engagement, lead us into these increasingly distant worlds. And the claim is that they lead to bad social and epistemic consequences. So I want to tie this to the philosophical concept of epistemic injustice, which became popularized in philosophy through the work of Miranda Fricker in her 2007 book, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing. And there she describes epistemic injustice as injustice with respect to who is and isn't regarded as an equal knower, as an equal contributor to systems of knowledge, who is and isn't treated as sort of credible and competent and reliable when they make knowledge claims. And epistemic injustice is a kind of social injustice, right? Who is and isn't given the full respect and recognition as a knowing agent is largely shaped by inequalities in things like social power, social recognition, power, oppression, privilege, and related social phenomena. Those who are structurally and systemically oppressed tend to be taken less seriously as knowing agents, owing to a variety of prejudicial stereotypes about members of their social group. So the example that Fricker and others use is the example of Tom Robinson in To Kill a Mockingbird, which probably many of you are familiar with the novel, but if you're not, right, you have a Black defendant who is being falsely accused of perpetrating a crime that all of the sort of concrete evidence suggests he could not have committed, that it would have been physically impossible for him to commit the crime. And nevertheless, the jury's assessment of his credibility is shaped in important ways by racial prejudicial stereotypes, right? Stereotypes, for example, that Black men are dangerous or violent or untrustworthy. Those stereotypes end up shaping the sort of epistemic evaluation of Robinson's claims, even in the face of sort of clear evidence to the contrary, or evidence that supports his testimony. This is epistemic injustice. Robinson isn't taken seriously as a credible knower or testifier of knowledge, owing to these prejudicial stereotypes. So social stereotypes are incredibly epistemically powerful. They shape who we expect to know, what we expect them to know, and how seriously we're likely to take them when they make a sort of testimonial claim. This has relevance to social media in many important ways. So first, social media algorithms are likely to exacerbate the harmful stereotypes that underlie epistemic injustice, making these epistemically powerful stereotypes more rigid, more difficult to resist, which is a problem for epistemic injustice and epistemic justice, both on and offline. So you can consider, for example, when people are sorted into epistemic worlds, stereotypical representations of outsiders are unlikely to go challenged. They're unlikely to be resisted. People with stereotypical views, say of marginalized groups, are better able to express them with like-minded communities online, to receive uptake for them, and so on. And moreover, stereotypical content can be explicitly targeted at people who are likely to be sort of sympathetic to engaging with it, right? This can be things like racialized caricatures or sexualized or misogynistic images of women, and so on. Second, the algorithms increase moral distance between social groups. So stereotypes are divisive on their own because they contribute to othering, which occurs when certain groups are marked as deviant or inferior to their dominant counterparts. And continued othering distances people from one another. It makes it harder to see our sort of shared humanity. It makes us feel like those people are just too different, right? And this can make it really difficult to do things like listen and learn from one another's perspectives or experiences. So algorithms on social media augment this kind of process of othering and moral distance, making, again, people even more divided from one another, it makes it even more difficult to see, hear, listen to, and learn from others, given this sort of growing distance. This, I think, is the kind of distance that Zeynep Tufekci describes and saying, look, there was a time in which we could sort of assume that people were getting their informational sort of exposure from the relatively similar or same sources, right? The same TV news stations and newspapers, but we don't live in that space anymore, right? And we now receive our information in a way that is increasingly distant, increasingly scattered, right? That can help distance us from one another in really problematic ways. Third, the algorithms increase epistemic distance between groups, which in turn leads to reliable epistemic gaps among people with relatively greater social power or privilege about the lives and experiences of those who are socially marginalized. It makes it more unlikely that socially dominant people or socially privileged people are going to have access to and come to understand the lives and experiences of the socially marginalized. And finally, social media algorithms are likely to further undermine social and epistemic trust, right? If we're leading people to inhabit epistemic worlds with others who they feel like and feel connection to, and are therefore more likely to form in-group trust, they're going to form a sort of corollary distrust with people on the outside. And again, when this effect negatively impacts members of marginalized groups so that they're unable to secure epistemic uptake, the problem of epistemic injustice is made worse. It's made more rigid. It's worth noting that many sort of commentators who write about the internet and social media have sort of articulated this problem, though perhaps not through the language of these philosophical concepts like epistemic injustice. So, for example, Avriel Epps-Darling has written that living in a world controlled by discriminatory algorithms can further segregate white youths from their peers of color, and gives some examples of that. And again, continues with the way that this kind of amplifies the voices of perhaps socially dominant people and perhaps minimizes the voices of socially non-dominant people. So the upshot here is that AI algorithms on social media are exacerbating epistemic injustice by feeding us content that reinforces social stereotypes, which are at the heart of epistemic injustice, increases othering and moral distance, which makes it harder to see and listen to and understand others, thereby heightens epistemic ignorance and worsens distrust among social groups. So the claim is that insofar as we care about social justice, we should pay attention to this problem and try to solve it. My final sort of theoretical point is that these kind of very subtle ways in which algorithms on social media can further corrode our epistemic and social environments are something we need to pay attention to as a matter of algorithmic justice. So there's been a lot of focus lately on the problem of algorithmic injustice and algorithmic oppression, but much of those dialogues have focused on these really large-scale sort of top-down injustices that are perpetrated by sort of major institutions, right? Like things like algorithmic bias in facial recognition data that's used in surveillance, algorithmic bias in parole and sentencing decisions, or in sort of sorting resumes, or in adjudicating credit applications, all kinds of things, which no doubt are incredibly important and are certainly a matter of algorithmic injustice and oppression. But if we only focus on these sort of large-scale macro or institutional level harms, we can miss part of the story when it comes to the way that algorithms more deeply entrench systems of social injustice and oppression. So I think it's important to try to tease out and give attention to the ways in which algorithms cause or promote sort of everyday injustice, right? The sort of micro injustices and various sort of everyday interpersonal injustices, such as things like stereotyping and microaggressions and other sorts of micro injustices that algorithms might make worse. So I believe that we need to interpret algorithmic injustice and algorithmic oppression more broadly in the sort of growing literature so that they include these macro harms, but also these sorts of micro harms that I've been describing. Okay, so algorithms on social media, I've argued, worsen the problem of epistemic injustice, which again is the tendency to see members of marginalized groups as less credible knowers and providers of knowledge, and related problems of heightened or worsened social division and distrust. I've argued that there are two processes at work here, those which my colleagues and I have named algorithmic sorting and algorithmic targeting. and that studies of algorithmic injustice and oppression need to account for this more micro sort of everyday impact of processes like these on our social practices, norms, ways of relating to one another, and so on. The sources are here. Again, I'm happy to share these with anyone who is interested. And again, I'm sorry I can't be there today. I would love to hear from anyone who wants to sort of chat about this stuff or tell me what you're thinking, or if you have any sort of ideas for how I can continue to sort of grow my work in this area. So again, thank you if you've been able to listen, and I would appreciate anyone who sort of wants to reach out over email to chat further. Thank you.